My name's Johnny Ashdown. I was born on 23rd of January 1943 on a Wednesday afternoon. My dad had a half day off work.
A full half day?
A full half day off work.
Yeah, right.
And that's how I become here.
Yeah, right. And so where were you born, mate?
I was born in a place called Whitehawk in Brighton. Whitehawk was a council estate, pretty rough, and it was after the war, and it was a pretty rough place to live.
And when it comes to countries preferred to live in, which one would you take, Australia or UK?
Australia is a marvellous place to live. Australia, we were here 50 years. Australia is a far higher standard of living than the UK, but of course it's a lower population. My mum and dad come from very large families in those days, 10, 12, 13 in the family. My mum and dad were working class people, and they were married at the age of 14, and we understand from the birth certificates 13 and 15. My dad was a very quiet man. He loved horses and grounds, and he'd done his time for his country. My mother's background, which we didn't know until recently, was from Manchester, and she had gypsy blood in her veins.
And what were gypsies?
I beg your pardon?
What were gypsies?
They were the people that lived on the roadside and people that the society didn't want, and they were a very outgoing race of people. But my mother had settled down with her mother. We can't find out about this, but in somewhere in Manchester. But she lived in a caravan most of her life. My father done all sorts of things in his life. He used to drive horses with six. He done a lot of navvying work. He done a lot of heavy work. And like everyone else, he fought for his country.
And John, what led you out here?
I've been asked this question many, many times, and it's the answer is not a short answer. I left school at the age of 14 and a half. My mother had died, and there was 9 of us in the family. My eldest sister, Violet, tried to bring us up. I had no other choice but to go and try and find a job. I first found a job in a garage, which we're paying then 14 shillings a week. That money wasn't enough, so then I started working on building sites. I worked as labouring, and concreting and rigging and scaffolding. It was some of the toughest men in the United Kingdom. And in them days, when there was no machinery to dig trenches, we called them cants. In them days, you slept in what they called a humpty, which was an old canvas shed with an old coke fire. And we used to sleep on the bags of cement to keep warm. I gradually worked my way up, and I got a chance on a big construction site in Sydney where I had some leadership powers, they tell me, and I worked my way up with the help of a lot of people on a very large building site to a construction foreman. In them days you clocked in and clocked out, and in them days you hired and fired exactly as you wanted to. No safety conditions, not much in the way of amenities. I worked my way round in the United Kingdom on building sites for many years. I ended up, and the question was asked why we come to Australia. My wife and I, and this is a story how I met my wife. I was running a big job called Sussex Guides in Brighton. And a Scotsman, Tommy McCarricker, said to me he had a friend and she was going to bring a friend with her tonight to have a date. Her name was, I didn't know then, her name was Rita Nancy Warnett. And Rita and we met in a pub called the Quadrant. And Rita and I, we got married within 6 to 7 months. Both our families said it wouldn't last. During our married life, Rita and I, we lost a child at stillbirth, and we've been through the ups and downs of being in and out of work. And the question was asked why we come to Australia. I was working on a runway called Gatwick Airport in February. Cold, wet, disgraceful conditions. I come home that night with some of the boys, and I said to my wife when we had a little rented place, shall we go to Australia? And first of all, Rita said, no way. But I said, there's better chances in Australia for us. And we just about set up home, and at that time we had 2 children. Sarah, our firstborn, and Lee, our secondborn. We approached Australia House, and we were accepted to come to Australia. It was a huge move for us, for in them days, we're talking about just before the 70s before. There was no help, and we were classed as the £10 Poms. And so we had our vaccinations, and we sold what little we had, and we come out with hardly any money, of course. And we come out to Australia. My wife had a sister out here, Janet. Her husband was in the RAF at Amberley. And so we, like many other migrants, we went to Heathrow Airport on the plane, landed at Sydney, and then flew up to Queensland. We were met at Brisbane Airport, very, very stark in them days. We were met by Rita's sister and brother and her husband, and we were taken. We went back to a place called Ipswich. Now, coming from a place called Brighton and London, Rita couldn't quite understand the starkness of Australia. And the funny side of the story is this, that Rita had wanted to use the toilet all the way over. And we got to Janet's place up there in Ipswich. And she asked her sister, Janet, where's the toilet? And Janet sort of had a smirk on her face and pointed down to the garden. And Rita said, is it down the garden? And Janet and Keith said, yes, it's down there, Rita. So Rita went down with all her makeup and her hair all done up and all her Gucci clothes on. The temperature then was about 35 degrees. And we heard a howl of disgust. And Rita comes running out and says, I'm not going to use that, I'm not going to use that. And of course, down the garden was the dunny with the sawdust and the tin and a lot of flies. Well, none of us know what Rita done to go to the loo, but somehow she managed something. So that was our first experience of Australia. I took a while to settle in with Janet and Keith, and then applied for a job with a company in Brisbane. And with my background as a construction foreman, high-risk, a man there by the name of Tom Scott used to work for a company in the United Kingdom called John Hollands, and he said, John, we'd like you to go to New Guinea, Bougainville. And so after travelling 12,000 miles with my little family, within 3 weeks I left them again to go and work on Bougainville in New Guinea as a construction foreman. As bad as what the conditions were in the United Kingdom for working class people at the time, nothing compared with the conditions that the New Guineans and the Papuans and the Chimbus suffered. Their wages, $2 a fortnight, 1 tin of bully beef and a carton of a bit of rice, calm with a boy, and bush Kanaka belonged me, $1. No shoes, no boots, paddling in concrete, reinforcing. And so it didn't quite go down well with me. And I had a few disputes about conditions, and the ultimatum was the company or the workforce. So I decided to resign. My union card goes back to 1965, where we paid sixpence a quarter, and I still have that union card to this day. And it wasn't a very strong union, the construction union in the United Kingdom. It wasn't as strong as the miners' union, and so the conditions on building sites was pretty cruel. You could be sacked any time within 5 minutes of arriving on site, and there was no safety inductions, and there was hardly any PPE at all. And so when I arrived back from New Guinea to Ipswich, Ipswich in them days, there wasn't much work for a man like me. And so Rita and I and the kids, with no furniture, no nothing, decided we'd go to Sydney. We got on the Greyhound bus and we looked at each other and we wondered if we'd done the right thing then by coming to Australia. It's very hard to explain when you leave your friends, your family, all your possessions that you'd worked for, and you come to a new country. We arrived in Sydney and we'd arranged to live in a place which we knew nothing about in the eastern suburbs called Rose Bay. And of course, when we saw Rose Bay and the children and Rita, we thought it was absolutely beautiful. And we rented a little place there, and I managed to get myself a job with a company called Costains. I was already involved with safety in the United Kingdom and safety in New Guinea. My background goes as a socialist. I've always cared about people, and I've never been very good with money, as my family would say. I worked in Sydney and I went for the highest money you could get, and then because I could read drawings and read all the specifications, I worked as a still fixer, which is a very arduous job in the sun and heat. And I often wondered which was the hardest to work in, the heat or the snow and the cold of the north wind in the United Kingdom. I, in the early 70s, met a man called Jack Mundy, who I admired, and the work that he was doing, Jack's background, they say, was a builder's labourer. That was to be determined, really. I was a builder's labourer. And at that time there was issues over the Kelly's Bush, issues over the rocks, pulling down the Federation houses and evicting returned soldiers from their home. Developers in Sydney were running the whole shebang. The union at that time was called the Builders Labourers Federation. There's probably people have said bad things about the BLF, and I'm very sad to say that the Labor Party and the rest of them had a lot to the demise of the Builders Labourers Federation. But the Builders Labourers Federation not only fought with a social conscience, they fought for working conditions for every man and every woman. And of course, like everything else, if you go against the system, then you are blacklisted. We fought developers that wanted to rip the heart out of Sydney. The rank and file was the best rank and file that I'd ever seen in my life. They were staunch and they fought for conditions. Eventually, politics, as always, wins, and they got the better of the Builders Labourers Federation. And in Victoria, with a man called Gallagher, who now they got rid of allegedly for building a beach house. Norm Gallagher would pale in significance to some of the corruption and the kickbacks that have happened since the Builders Labourers. They said the Builders Labourers were a standover group. We were. We stood over developers that had no thought, no sincerity, no humanity for what they pulled down or what they destroyed and who they destroyed. And so I became involved with that. I was elected as a delegate with my knowledge as a safety rep and an executive. Trade unions had to change their names from the ASC&J to BWIU, and then we had to change our name again to the CMFEU. We fought, and I fought, for safety on construction sites to try and get people to live a bit longer. Family men that could go to work and come home in safety. And also, later on, female workers could work on site with no harassment and work alongside their fellow workers, being the men, and we fought for that. The company where I was first delegate was a company called Concrete Constructions, particularly tough on trade unions, and most like any other company played lip service to safety. I met some marvellous people throughout the trade union movement, some marvellous politicians who I won't name because it's not fair to them without their permission. But we fought, and I put ideas in the heads of some of the people from the BWIU and about safety. And they used to call me a maverick. They couldn't control me. I used to have my union meetings in 7 different languages so everyone could understand. And as they called them wogs in them days, they never give a shit about them. I did. And they used to call me the nickname of the Pommy Wog. Well, during this time, we started safety committees, we started safe work method statements, and with the help of Work Cover, who at times are just a white elephant, we started to change the way that construction sites work and how people are treated. I've seen a lot of fatalities on building sites, and with me, if I didn't know anything, I would get in the back door, change my name, even to go onto the railways as track awareness courses. I was the first one to start safety inductions and to start safe work method statements. They said I used to go over the top on safety and use safety as a industrial weapon. Not at all. In 1980, thereabouts, we got the first female construction workers on sites in 72 George Street, and they affectionately call it Ashdown Towers. We brought in melanoma skin cream for the workers when they take their shirts off. We explained to workers about what the sun can do to you with cancer. We went all through swinging stages outside of building sites, where you put a stage over the side of the building, no one checks it, and people are killed. I have 1,000 photographs of incidents on building sites where men were maimed and killed. It was difficult at this time for my lovely wife Rita, who worked in a store in Bondi Junction. We were threatened with our lives. I was blacklisted, of course, and I was bribed. And I said to Rita one day, after we'd come up to Harvey Bay, and we couldn't pay the electricity bill, and I said to Rita, if I'd have took all the dives and bribes in Sydney, we could have bought Harvey Bay. And my lovely wife looked over and said, I wouldn't have lived with you, and you wouldn't have lived with me. We fought asbestos. We fought for every issue of tag and testing of leads, electrical, and we started safety committees. Unions done this, trade unions. And now people say that unions are insignificant. Unions now are more prevalent today than what they ever were. We started in the mines with black lung. We had people like John Maitland, and we had people who tried to make the conditions for those poor miners. I was a high-rise man, not a miner, but I went down 2 mines, and my word, I couldn't work down there with them conditions. Now it's better, and now we hope that in the future that the safety on construction sites is a bit better than when I started. I was involved with the politics in Sydney, and without naming names, I had support from a lot of good people. We raised money for Children's Hospital Camperdown, millions. And we raised money for Starlight Foundations and Make-A-Wish. On this job called the Karen Bush or Ashdown Towers, they used to call my office the Kremlin. And when the workers come there, we just checked they made sure that their subcontractors paid their bus, their super and their PPE, and make sure that they were getting their conditions as per the code of practice and as per the award then. And so when you go against the grain with some powerful people, they immediately blacklist you. And they tell me I was blacklisted from here to Japan. I had a nervous breakdown in Sydney in the late 80s and 90s. And I will say this, I never took a sick day in my life. I never used long service in my life. And I never took anything that I never worked for. Whether I should have done or I should not have done, and whether I've done the right thing, but in this interview I've left out a lot of things that I should say and could say. But I'm hoping a book may come out, and I'm hoping in the book I can go in more details about the life that we've had. And that, all through this, my wife, who used to stagger home from Bondi Junction, Coles, and we used to raffle meat trays for the children. We used to have parties for the kids. All the things that trade union done. And I will emphasise that I was never ever alone. I had a very good team with me from all walks of trades, plumbers and carpenters and concreters and riggers. And when we started our safety committee meetings, it was called the freedom of speech and the right of reply. I worked with asbestos to see what it was like. Everyone, when you talk about things, unless you experience them, you don't know. I went and worked with these men and women removing asbestos, wearing suits and neck gear where you have to work inside what they call a bubble. During all this time, I'd done all my training again, OH&S, trainer, track awareness, human resources, not for the benefit of Johnny Ashdown, but for the benefit of the working class. And I'll always be in a very small cog in a big wheel. But I was very proud when we used to have May Days and World Peace Days, and we had a social conscience, and we fought and we stood up for each other. Sometimes I think we've gone backwards with the freedom of speech in Australia, and sometimes I look and think, were the old days as bad as where I paint them? But I do feel sorry now for a lot of people, young people in the industry, where they fast track them through safety meetings, fast track them through trades. And it's not a good thing to say as a builder and a carpenter and a concreter, that the standard has gone down. When I first came to Australia, the Australian standard was very, very good. But I'm afraid now, the speed. And there's something I'd like to clear up, and they talk about, news shock jocks talk about this, they used to talk about us, lazy builders, labourers. Well, let me say to you that the word labourer I never used. I used the word construction worker. It's amazing to me that a construction worker has to do the steel, which is the most important part, the concrete, the formwork, the rigging, the scaffolding, and every other carcass work of that building, and yet they're still classed as semi-skilled. It amazes me. I used to get in big trouble with this, that when a bricklayer puts one brick on top of the other brick, he's a tradesman. And I could never get this through the ACTU, with Kelty and the rest of them, to explain the skills of construction workers. And so, with this and the pressure of sticking up for workers, not on my own, with a team, not only did I upset the bosses of the big companies, but I upset some leaders of other trade unions and my union. People like Andrew Ferguson and the Ferguson family that pretend to be Labour and Socialist is the biggest load of bollocks you've ever heard. They're opportunists. They think it's their right to be secretaries of unions. When we had a vote, and when I was elected to the executive, the highest position you can on a union, they put me on the donkey vote. I got 39,000 votes from the rank and file, 8.9% more than anybody else. And so the power I had, they were terrified of. And so there are good people and bad people in trade unions. I never believed, and I always believed, a fair day's work, a fair day's pay. I never believed in dives and bribes. And sometimes my wife used to say to me, you think more of other people than you do of us. She's probably right now in retrospect, God bless her. And so I'm coming to the end of my life now with asbestos and fighting asbestos in courts of law and sticking up for people with mesothelioma, people like poor old Bernie Banton, And the trade union movement, which I belong to, had some marvellous people, that fought asbestos with us for many years. Many, many years, against a company called James Hardy. We've seen people die, and that's what I'll die of. But I've worked in the shit and snow of England. I've been so cold. My hands have been so raw where you couldn't make love to your wife when you come home from work. I've laid on concrete floors for the night, waiting to get a job the next day. It's very hard to explain what happens 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But the exploitation of workers is still going on. And workers will always be exploited, and there is more need, as I said before, for a vibrant trade union. A trade union which is honest and true to its membership. Without collegiate voting, it's a true vote from the rank and file. I believe there is hope for trade unions in the future. With all new technology, more people will be fighting for employment. And that's why I truly believe that with a big effort from the ACTU, that trade unions can represent workers again in a true and honest fashion.